The door was locked, the curtains stayed drawn, and the woman who owned everything on that land was staring at me like she'd finally decided to stop pretending. "Tell me the truth," she said, voice thin as a razor, "or don't bother speaking at all." That's how it starts, not with a scream, not with a gunshot, with a question that can get people buried. See, I wasn't supposed to be in the middle of their marriage. I was supposed to be in the middle of life and death, hands steady, eyes sharp, quiet. The kind of person folks call when they're too scared to call anyone else. They called me safe hands. I delivered babies on that plantation and the ones around it, not because anybody cared about me, because they cared about what I could save. They bought me for one reason. A white woman in a big house was 6 months along and terrified she'd bleed out like the stories she'd heard. So they paid a heavy price for a girl who knew herbs, pressure, patience, and how to keep her mouth shut. That's the first rule in any world, Harlem or low country. If you're valuable, they don't treat you better. They just make sure you're close enough to use. I was given a cabin near the main house. Close enough that if the mistress started screaming in the night, I could be there before the panic turned into a funeral. And they told me plain what would happen if I failed. Not we'd be disappointed. Not we'd find someone else. They told me I'd be punished until I begged for the mercy of dying. So when the first birth came, I did what I always do when the stakes get ugly. I slowed down. Let the noise stay outside my mind. Let the fear belong to them. I kept my hands calm and my eyes honest. The baby came clean. A boy, healthy lungs, strong cry. The master smiled like he'd invented breathing. He gave me a dress and extra meat like that made us even. Like my sweat and his reward belonged on the same scale. That's the game. You save their bloodline, they toss you a scrap and call it generosity. After that, the house trusted me. Not like family. Never that. More like a weapon they kept sharpened. The mistress looked at me differently. Not soft, not kind, just aware. And word traveled. Rich men have a talent for sharing what benefits them. Soon other plantations started sending for me. Their wives in silk rooms, sweating through labor, gripping sheets, praying to a god they didn't treat me like I had. Sometimes I'd be called into those fine houses, and the master I belonged to would collect his fee like he did the work. $20 a berth, money that never touched my palm. Then I'd go back to the quarters where the women didn't get silk. They got dirt floors and a clock that didn't care how much pain they were in. Those berths were different, quiet in a way that was worse. Because pain is loud when you're allowed to be human. Pain goes silent when you're not. I did what I could. Herbs I gathered. Remedies I made in secret. Advice I whispered when an overseer wasn't close enough to hear. Most of the time, they had to be back at work before their bodies finished bleeding. And that's when I started seeing it. Not all at once. Not like lightning. More like a pattern you can't unsee once it shows itself. The first one was a boy, born to a young woman from the quarters. The child had brown skin, but his face carried a signature. Same set to the eyes, same cut of the nose, same chin that sat on the master's face like a stamp of ownership. I remember wiping that baby clean and feeling cold spread through me like winter water. The mother watched me watching him. She didn't ask for help. She didn't cry. She didn't plead like a woman in trouble. She whispered like a woman standing on a ledge. "Don't," she said. Just one word. That was all she had to give me. And I understood. Because on that land, truth wasn't a light. Truth was a blade, so I nodded once. I didn't say his name. I didn't say the master's name. I didn't say anything that could travel, but inside my head something snapped into place. I started paying attention. At first I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was tired, that faces are faces. But then it happened again. Another baby, another mother, another child wearing the same mark. And then again. Different cabins, different women. Same man showing up in the bones of children he would never claim. I'd seen men in power do disgusting things. Everybody had, but this wasn't just sin. This was a ledger, account. A shadow family growing right under the mistress's windows, living in the heat and mud while the real children ate from silver. And I realized something that made my stomach tight. Everybody knew. The women knew because they lived it. The house slaves knew because they heard everything. The overseers knew because men like that don't hide their appetites from other men. And the mistress, she knew too, but she wore her ignorance like perfume. She let it sit on her skin because it was easier than facing the stink underneath. That's what people do when they can't win a fight. They convince themselves the fight doesn't exist. Me, I don't have that luxury. I started keeping track, not out loud, not where anybody could see, on scraps, on the backs of discarded pages, on anything I could get my hands on without raising questions. Tiny writing, tight lines, dates, names of mothers, sex of the baby, and one other detail I didn't write for my own curiosity. I wrote it because I wanted proof the world couldn't swallow. Who the child looked like. I hid those papers like they were contraband, wrapped, sealed, buried where footsteps wouldn't find them. Because if they caught me writing, that was one kind of trouble. If they caught me writing that, it wasn't trouble. It was a death sentence that came with an audience. Years passed like that, birth after birth, quiet entries, quiet mouth, and the count kept rising. White babies in the big house got names like they were crowns. They got christenings, gifts, futures promised before they could walk. The babies in the quarters got work waiting for them like a trap, and the ones with the master's face. They got the master's blood without any of the master's protection. That's how power moves. It takes what it wants, then denies it ever touched it. I watched those children grow, some light enough that folks looked twice, some darker but still wearing his structure like a mask they never asked for. And then the question finally came from the only mouth that could shake the whole place. It wasn't the master. Men like that don't question themselves. It wasn't me. I knew what silence costs, but I also knew what speaking could cost more. It was a child, a little boy from the big house, running in like he owned the air because he thought he did. He burst into the room while I was tending the mistress. She was older now, swollen with another pregnancy, trying to hold herself together like dignity was a corset. The boy was breathing hard, eyes wide, excited like he'd found something interesting. "Mother," he said, "I saw the new baby near the quarters." The mistress didn't even look up at first, just a tired and. The boy frowned, confused. Why does he look like father? That room went still, not quiet like peace, quiet like a loaded gun. The mistress froze with one hand pressed against her belly. I froze with my herbs midair. The boy didn't understand what he'd stepped into. He was too young to see the trap he'd just sprung. But I saw it, because I've seen men get killed for less than a child's honest question. The mistress tried to smooth it over, said something about features, coincidence, the kind of lie that's supposed to sound like common sense if you say it with enough confidence. But the boy wouldn't let go. He pushed again. Innocent, persistent, dangerous without knowing it. And when she sent him away, her face didn't follow him. Her eyes came to me, not as a woman asking a servant, as a woman asking the only person in that house who had been close enough to the truth to count it. "You," she said, barely above a whisper. "You've been there, you've seen them." She swallowed hard like the words tasted bitter. "Do they look like my husband?" That's the moment the whole board shifts, because now it wasn't just her pride at risk, it was me. If I lied, the lie would keep me alive. Maybe. If I told the truth, I'd be putting a torch to 15 years of silence. And I wasn't just holding my own life in my hands. I was holding the lives of those mothers, those children, every person who ever stood too close to the master's appetite. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, slow, heavy, like footsteps down a hallway. The mistress leaned forward. Her eyes weren't soft. They weren't kind. They were hungry for proof, for confirmation. For someone else to say what she'd been avoiding since the first time she saw that face in the wrong place. I kept my voice low, measured, because if you're going to drop a truth like a stone into water, you don't throw it screaming. You let it sink. "Yes," I said, "they do." The mistress didn't speak. Her mouth opened, closed. Then she asked the question that makes men lose kingdoms. "How many?" I didn't blink. 15. She inhaled like the room had run out of air, and then she said something that made the skin on my arms tighten. "Prove it." I could have played dumb, I could have backtracked, I could have tried to patch the silence back together, but I was tired. Tired of watching the master move through bodies like he owned the future. Tired of watching those children grow up as evidence nobody was allowed to mention. So I gave her the only answer that mattered. I kept records, I told her, her eyes sharpened. Bring them to me, she said, tomorrow. And just like that, the most dangerous thing on that plantation wasn't the master's temper. It was a handful of paper. Because once you put truth in someone else's hands, you can't call it back. And that night, as I dug beneath my cabin floor for the box I'd hidden from God and devils alike, I realized something else. If the master found out before morning, he wouldn't just come for me. He'd come for every name I ever wrote down. I didn't sleep that night, not because of fear. Fear is loud. This was quieter than that. This was calculation. I dug slow, careful. Every scrape of dirt felt like it carried sound farther than it should. When the tin finally showed, I didn't rush. I cleaned it, unwrapped it, looked at the weight of it in my hands. 15 years of truth, folded small enough to bury, sharp enough to cut a dynasty. By morning, the plantation was moving like it always did. Orders being barked. Bodies being spent. The master riding out like he owned the sun. That mattered. Timing is everything. Harlem taught that long before I ever heard the name. The mistress had the sitting room locked when I arrived, curtains tight. Chairs placed like this was a negotiation, not a confession. She didn't greet me. Put them here, she said, pointing to the table. I laid the papers down, didn't explain, didn't defend. You don't talk over evidence. She read slow, slower than most people read lies. Because truth demands respect, even from those who hate it. Her face changed with every name. Not shocked, not surprised, validated. That's the dangerous part. Because rage backed by certainty doesn't need witnesses. When she finished, she didn't cry. She didn't shout. She looked up at me and said, I want to see them. I thought I misheard. All of them, she continued, the children. That wasn't curiosity. That was preparation. I knew what that could mean. I knew what usually followed a white woman deciding she'd had enough humiliation. People disappeared for less, but her eyes weren't wild. They were focused, controlled. The kind of look men get right before they move money, muscle, or blood. Tomorrow, she said, bring them here. I nodded because nodding keeps you breathing. The next morning I did something that felt like pulling a pin. I went from cabin to cabin, plantation to plantation, making excuses, using my position like a badge nobody questioned. Medical checks, inspections, midwife business. Overseers grumbled but stepped aside. They always do when you carry authority wrapped in usefulness. By midday they were there. 15 children, some tall enough to work the fields like men, some barely walking, different mothers, different shades, same face looking back at the world in fragments. They stood behind my cabin, quiet, confused, the older ones already understanding that silence is armor. When the mistress walked down from the house, the air shifted. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil. She walked among them slowly. Studied them like pieces on a board she'd ignored too long. I watched her hands. They were shaking, not fear, recognition. This one, she said softly, stopping in front of a boy nearly grown. He has his eyes. Yes, I said, and her, pointing to a girl holding her mother's skirt. His mouth. Yes. She turned in a slow circle, took them all in. These are my husband's children, she said, not asking. That sentence cracked something open, because once you say it out loud, it stops being rumor. It becomes liability. She asked about consent. I didn't dress it up. Slaves don't refuse, I said. She closed her eyes like she'd been slapped by truth itself. When it was done, she sent them away. No speeches, no mercy, just dismissal. Back inside, she poured herself a drink with hands that finally steadied. What do I do? She asked. That's the question people ask when power runs out of excuses. Before I could answer, shouting exploded from the main house. The master was back early. Doors slammed. Voices rose. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I knew that sound. It's the sound of a man realizing his secrets are no longer safe. And when he stormed out later, face dark, eyes hunting. They landed on my cabin. That's when I understood. This wasn't just about children anymore. It was about control, and somebody was about to lose it. When a man like that starts losing control, he doesn't collapse, he calculates. The master didn't come for me right away. That would have been messy, emotional, and men like him don't like mess unless they can blame it on someone else. Instead, he waited. That's how you know you're dealing with real danger. 3 days passed. No summons. No punishment. No raised voice in my direction. That silence was heavier than any threat. The mistress stayed out of sight. The house went stiff. Even the servants moved like they were walking through glass. Then I was called to the study. Not dragged, invited, that's worse. He sat behind his desk like nothing had shifted, papers stacked, ledger open, a man pretending he was still the only one keeping score. My wife tells me you've been writing, he said, not angry, curious. I kept my eyes down. Respect is theater, but theater matters. Yes, sir. What exactly have you been writing? I chose my words like stepping stones. Records, births, medical details. He smiled thin, and resemblances. There it was, the blade under the table. Yes, I said. He leaned back, studied me the way men study tools before deciding whether to keep or break them. You understand, he said, that what you've done could be considered dangerous. I didn't argue. Arguing is for people with leverage. Yes, sir. Silence again, long enough to measure my pulse. Then he sighed like a man forced into generosity. My wife has insisted on a solution. That word carried weight. Certain people will be freed, he continued. The women, the children, you. My chest tightened, but I didn't show it. Freedom offered by a man like that is never clean. It always comes with an edge. You'll be sent north, he said, with papers, money, escorts, out of my sight. Exile disguised as mercy, and if I refuse, I asked quietly, his eyes sharpened, you won't. Because he was right. Freedom on his terms was better than death on mine. 2 weeks later, we were loaded onto wagons like cargo pretending to be passengers. Mothers clutching papers they didn't trust yet. Children staring at land they'd never see again. The master watched us go like he was losing inventory. The mistress watched from a window, face unreadable. Victory doesn't always look proud. The road north was slow, careful, every stop calculated. Slave catchers don't care about papers if the price is right. I kept my records close because documents are power and power travels. In Philadelphia, the world changed shape, noise, movement. Black people walking free without asking permission. The mothers learned to breathe again. The children learned to dream dangerously, but freedom attracts predators. 3 years later, a slave catcher came knocking. Forged claims, hired muscle, a badge that didn't care about truth. He reached for one of the boys. I stepped forward. No, I said. He laughed. That piece of paper won't save you. I pulled out my records, dates, names, birthmarks, faces described before they'd grown into themselves. The judge read, compared, looked at the boy. The resemblance did the rest. Case dismissed. The hunter left empty-handed. That's when I understood the full weight of what I'd done. I hadn't just delivered babies. I'd built leverage. And leverage, when used right, doesn't just free people. It keeps them free. But somewhere far south, a man was counting losses. And men like that don't forget who made them bleed. Time passed, but it didn't smooth anything over. It sharpened it. Up north, freedom looked clean from a distance. Streets wide, churches open. Schools that didn't whisper. But beneath that, the game was still the game. Different rules, same predators. I worked every day, delivering babies into rooms where the child belonged to the mother, not a ledger. That alone felt like rebellion. Word spread fast, not about where I came from, about what I could do. Women trusted me. Trust is currency when nothing else is stable. I trained others, passed the knowledge forward, because skills die if you hoard them. And the children, they grew. The ones with his face learned early that appearance could be weapon or shield. Some leaned into it. Some rejected it. All of them understood it was never neutral. One of them, the oldest boy, asked me once, "Do you think he thinks about us?" I didn't answer right away. Men like their father don't think about consequences. They think about control. He thinks about what he lost, I said finally, not who. That was enough. Then the loss shifted. New rules, new reach, old chains and new handwriting. Slave catchers grew bold. Free papers meant less. Accusations meant more. One night a knock came hard and late. Men outside, voices sharp, demanding entry. I didn't open the door. I gathered my records. Because when force arrives, truth has to be faster than fear. By morning, lawyers were involved, abolitionists, judges who still cared about evidence. Once again, the papers held. Once again, the truth survived muscle. But that night taught me something. Freedom is not a destination. It's a perimeter you defend every day. I aged, my hands slowed, my eyes dimmed. The children became elders, then parents, then grandparents. Faces once marked by a master now carried new names, new futures. The man who owned them died rich and remembered poorly. That's the final insult power hates, to be erased by the lives it tried to bury. Before I stepped away from the work, I placed my records somewhere they couldn't be burned or buried, because stories disappear when no one protects them. Truth needs witnesses, and I knew something else too. Somebody somewhere would always try to own what doesn't belong to them. But now they'd have to fight paper, memory, and bloodlines that refuse to vanish. And that's a war no tyrant ever really wins. The danger never left. It just learned my name. People think the danger ends when the chains come off. That's a lie told by folks who never had anything worth hunting. The danger just changes clothes. By the time my hands started to ache in the mornings, my name carried weight, not the kind you brag about. The kind people lower their voices around. The kind that keeps doors from slamming shut when trouble walks in. I didn't advertise what I'd done. I didn't have to. Paper travels. Stories move faster than bodies. And truth, once it's tasted blood, never forgets how. Young women came to me not just to give birth, but to ask questions they were afraid to ask anyone else. How do I keep my child safe? How do I disappear? How do I prove who I am if someone tries to take me? I taught them what I knew, how to keep records, how to copy them, how to hide them. How to make truth heavier than a lie. Because muscle fades, money moves, but ink lasts. Sometimes late at night I'd think about the plantation, about that first baby with his father's face, about the mistress's hands shaking when she finally let herself see. I didn't hate her. Hate takes energy, strategy takes clarity. She made her move when her world cracked. Not out of mercy, out of survival. And survival, no matter who's doing it, is still a form of honesty. The man, though. The man never forgave. I knew that without being told. Men like him don't chase what they can't reach. They wait. They let time do the work. They hope memory softens edges. But memory didn't soften here. It multiplied. Every child who learned to read. Every grandchild who carried a face he couldn't erase. Every document stamped, filed, protected. That was interest compounding. Near the end, when my breath shortened and the nights grew longer, a young man visited me. Well-dressed, careful eyes, southern accent buried under polish. He didn't give his name. He didn't have to. "I've been sent to ask," he said, "if the records still exist." I studied him the way I used to study newborns, looking past what he showed. "They do," I said. "Where?" I smiled slow. "Everywhere that matters." He nodded, stood, left without another word. That's when I knew the game was truly over. Because if they were still searching, it meant the truth was still dangerous. And dangerous truth is powerful truth. When I finally closed my eyes for the last time, I wasn't afraid. I'd already won. Not by shouting. Not by fighting. Not by breaking anything with my hands. I won by watching, by writing, by waiting. And somewhere out there, someone still feels uneasy when they hear my story. Good, that means it's still working. They buried me quiet. No speeches loud enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. No headlines, just people who knew what I'd done standing close, heads bowed, eyes sharp. The kind of gathering that looks like grief but feels like strategy. Because even after a woman is gone, what she leaves behind can still make men nervous. The records didn't sleep with me. They were already moving. Copies layered on copies. Names passed mouth to ear. Ink turned into memory. Memory turned into instruction. Young ones asked about me like I was a warning, not a legend. Is it true she wrote everything down? Is it true she faced them and lived? The answer was always the same. She understood the game. Years went by. Laws changed again. New uniforms, new language, same old hunger for control. Every so often, someone would knock on a door asking questions that sounded polite but weren't. A clerk, a lawyer, A man with clean hands and dirty curiosity. They wanted to know where the proof was kept. They wanted to know which names connected to which bloodlines. They wanted to know if certain children, certain families could still be traced, and every time they were told the same thing. You can't burn what's already scattered, because the truth wasn't sitting in one box anymore. It was walking, teaching, giving birth, owning property, signing papers, voting, raising children who didn't flinch when questioned. That's what really scared them, not the past, the future that remembered. Somewhere far from where I was laid to rest, a man stared at a mirror and recognized a face he'd been taught to deny. Somewhere else, a ledger was opened by hands that didn't want what they were about to find. And somewhere a question was forming again. Not from a child this time, from someone powerful enough to act on the answer. Because as long as there are people who build empires on silence, there will always be someone trying to erase the record. And the only thing more dangerous than the truth being written is the truth still being protected. The thing about truth is, it doesn't stay where you leave it, it travels. Years after I was gone, my name stopped being spoken like a memory and started being spoken like a warning. Quiet, careful, usually behind closed doors, because the children didn't just survive, they learned. They learned how power actually works, how men lie when they're cornered, how institutions smile while sharpening knives, how paper can outweigh fists if you stack it right. Some of them went into schools, some into churches, some into printing rooms and court buildings. Places where words turn into weapons if you know how to aim them. None of them carried the master's name, but his shadow followed them anyway. That's the part people don't understand about bloodlines. You don't control where they go. You don't decide what they become. You only decide whether they come back to haunt you. Every now and then a story would surface. A claim challenged, a land dispute that didn't add up, a man with money discovering that a family he'd never acknowledged had receipts older than his arrogance. And somewhere in those cases my records appeared, not always the originals, sometimes copies of copies, sometimes transcriptions passed hand to hand, but the structure held. Dates don't lie, birthmarks don't forget, faces don't change their origins. That's when people started asking a different question. Not did it happen, but how many times did this happen elsewhere? Because once you prove one man did it for years, unchecked, unashamed, protected, you expose the system that led him. That's when the danger widened. Because now it wasn't about one plantation, it was about the whole operation. There were men who didn't want that door opened, men with old money and newer fear, men who understood that if the past ever stood up straight it would knock a lot of pillars down, so they applied pressure, quiet pressure. Funding dried up, positions disappeared, papers went missing. But it didn't work the way they expected, because the people protecting the truth weren't asking permission anymore. They de-learned the lesson early. Never keep everything in one place. Never trust one gatekeeper. Never assume power won't panic. And panic is loud if you know how to listen. The last time my name surfaced in a room full of important men, it ended the same way it always did. Silence, not agreement. Fear. Because fear is what happens when control realizes it's no longer alone on the board. And somewhere, right now, someone is still digging, still asking, still searching for a way to bury what should never have been written. But they're too late. The truth already moved, and whoever tries to corner it next is going to learn the same lesson they all do. You can own land, you can own bodies, you can even own laws, but once the record exists, you never own the ending. The last thing power ever expects is patience, not the lazy kind, not waiting around, the kind that watches, counts, remembers, the kind that lets generations do the talking. By the time the men who started it were dust, the damage they caused was still breathing, walking, signing its own name. Some of the children carried success like armor, owned businesses, sat in rooms their fathers were never meant to imagine them entering. Others lived quieter lives but no less dangerous to the lie, because normalcy is the enemy of myth. Every free birth made the old story weaker. Every educated mind made denial harder. And every time someone tried to trace a lineage, tried to clean a family tree by cutting off the uncomfortable branches, the roots pushed back. Hard. I used to say this to the women I trained when they asked why I never stopped writing things down. Because someday, I'd tell them, someone will try to tell your child who they are. And you'll need proof. That day kept coming. In courtrooms, in schools, in offices where men spoke softly and expected obedience. But the answers were already waiting. Filed, copied, memorized. The truth didn't need me anymore. That's how you know you did it right, because real power isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself. It sets things in motion and lets time do the damage. Some nights I imagined those children's children standing somewhere they were never supposed to stand, feeling a strange sense of unease from people who can't quite place why they're uncomfortable. That's legacy. Not monuments, not praise. Not names carved in stone. Pressure. Pressure that never lets a lie rest easy again. And as long as someone somewhere is still trying to erase what happened, that means the truth is still alive, which means the game isn't over. It's just waiting for the next move. Here's the part nobody likes to admit. The truth doesn't end wars. It chooses sides. Long after the record spread, long after the faces blended into new cities and new futures, there were still men studying old maps, old ledgers, old bloodlines. Men who didn't want justice. They wanted containment. They weren't chasing names anymore. They were chasing influence, trying to see how far the damage had traveled, trying to measure how much power had slipped through their fingers without them noticing. Because once a lie collapses in one place, it weakens everywhere it was holding weight. And that scared them. I saw it coming before I ever put ink to paper. That moment when someone powerful realizes the past isn't buried, it's organized. That's when they start asking dangerous questions like, who else knows? Who taught them? Where did this start? Those questions don't lead to apologies, they lead to cleanups. That's why the records were never about revenge. Revenge burns hot and fast. This was about leverage that ages well. I didn't need to be alive for it to work. I just needed it to exist long enough to outlive denial. Some nights somewhere, a descendant opens a box they were told never to open, sees a name they weren't supposed to recognize, notices a resemblance they've spent a lifetime ignoring, and the silence that follows. That's not peace, that's fear doing math, because once you realize the truth survived you, you understand something too late. You were never in control. You were just standing on borrowed time. And somewhere out there, someone is about to connect the last dot. They just don't know yet what it's going to cost them when they do. The scariest thing about truth isn't what it says, it's who it gives courage to. Years after the last courtroom stopped echoing my name, the records began doing something I never planned for. They stopped defending people. They started arming them. Young men and women born free, raised sharp, used those old pages to challenge contracts, inheritances, land deals that had been stitched together with polite lies. They weren't loud about it. They didn't march in angry lines. They filed paperwork. They asked questions in rooms where questions weren't welcome. They smiled while pulling threads men thought were permanent. And every time one thread came loose, someone powerful leaned back in their chair and felt the floor tilt just a little. That's when the pressure came back, not from the South, not from plantations or overseers, from institutions, banks, courts, boards that claimed neutrality but protected bloodlines like sacred ground. The tactic changed. They stopped denying the past. They tried to reframe it, call it complicated, call it contextual, call it unfortunate but irrelevant. That's how you know you're close. Because when power can't erase something, it tries to shrink it. One night, a woman sat alone at a desk in a city far from where I'd ever walked. She held a copy of my handwriting in her hands. Same tight lines, same careful dates. Her name didn't matter. Her position did. She understood what she was looking at. She also understood what would happen if she let it surface. Promotion or principle, legacy or comfort, safety or truth. She reached for a pen and hesitated, because once she signed her name to what she knew, the record wouldn't just speak anymore, it would accuse. And somewhere at the same moment, another man, older, richer, very sure of his place in the world, felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The kind that comes when you realize something buried long ago has just taken a breath. The kind that comes right before the past knocks. It didn't break the way people expect things to break. No shouting. No trials splashed across papers. No men dragged down steps in cuffs. Just a file. One file placed in the wrong hands or the right ones depending how you see it. It surfaced during a routine review. Old assets, old trusts, old names nobody thought to question anymore. The kind of paperwork that only matters if you're looking for patterns instead of comfort. And this time someone was looking. The handwriting was familiar to the wrong people. Tight, deliberate, calm. The kind of writing that doesn't ask permission to exist. Dates lined up too clean to ignore. Birth records intersecting with property transfers. Faces that matched portraits nobody talked about. The story told itself without ever raising its voice. Phones rang behind closed doors. Meetings happened off the calendar. And who'd inherited power without understanding it suddenly realized they were standing on something hollow. They didn't argue about whether it was true. That's important. They argued about how far it went. Because once one record holds, others become suspect. And suspicion is poison in rooms built on certainty. One man, old money, clean reputation, name etched into places that don't forget, tried to shut it down quietly. Donations, favors, pressure applied like velvet over steel. It worked. For about a week. Then someone else made a copy, and another. That's when the tone changed. You could hear it in the pauses, in the way sentences didn't finish anymore, in the sudden politeness of men who used to command. They weren't afraid of exposure. They were afraid of precedent. Because if one buried truth stood up and walked, others would follow. And there's no defense against a future that knows how to read. The file didn't accuse anyone directly. It didn't need to. It just existed. And existence was enough. Somebody resigned for personal reasons. Somebody else stepped aside to protect the institution. Endowments shifted. Names were quietly removed from walls. Histories were rewritten with surgical care, not denial. That's how real power retreats, not in flames, in edits. And somewhere far from those rooms, a descendant who'd never known why doors opened a little slower for them felt something shift. Not justice. Recognition. Because when the truth finally forces its way into daylight, it doesn't ask for forgiveness. It just changes who gets to speak next. And that scared them more than anything. Power never apologizes, it just adjusts. By the time anyone thought to trace the damage back to its origin, there was nothing left to confront. No villain to point at, no single name to curse. Just a long chain of decisions that suddenly didn't look accidental anymore. That's the genius of truth when it's handled right. It doesn't need a champion, it becomes a climate. The institutions survived, of course. They always do, but they came out quieter. Less certain, more careful about the stories they told and the names they protected. Because once you know the past can reach you, you start watching the future differently. The families who'd been erased didn't get monuments. They didn't get public apologies or ceremonial closures. What they got was access. Doors that used to stay shut opened without explanation. Questions that once stalled now moved forward. Assumptions lost their grip. And the people who benefited from the old silence felt it every day. In meetings where their words didn't land the same. In rooms where their authority suddenly needed proof. In legacies that could no longer pretend to be clean. That's how you know the balance shifted. Not because the powerful fell, but because they stopped being untouchable. Somewhere, a young person learned their history from records that were never meant to survive. They learned that their existence wasn't an accident and neither was their struggle. They didn't feel anger. They felt clarity, and clarity is dangerous because it doesn't rush. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need permission. It waits, just like I did, just like the records did, and just like the truth always does. It stayed alive long enough to win. There's one last thing nobody ever writes down. After the files settled, after the names were adjusted, after the institutions learned how to breathe again, someone started watching the watchers, not out of anger, out of habit. Because once you understand how power hides, you also understand how it returns. New money stepped in, new faces, same instincts, different century, same hunger. Somebody tried to seal the cracks, to tighten control, to make sure no more records slipped through the seams. They called it modernization, efficiency, protection. That's how it always starts again. But this time they weren't dealing with a lone woman writing by candlelight. They were dealing with people who grew up knowing exactly what paper can do. Digital copies, distributed archives, redundancy stacked on redundancy, truth with backups, no single box to steal, no single voice to silence. Just systems built by people who learned early that survival is documentation. Somewhere tonight, someone powerful is reviewing a report and feeling that familiar pressure in their chest. Not because of what's in front of them, but because of what might already be somewhere else. Unseen, unstoppable, waiting. Because the most dangerous thing in any system isn't rebellion, it's a memory that refuses to die. And the game is never really over, it just learns new rules.